Close your eyes for a moment. Picture yourself freezing, not "forgot my jacket" cold, but the kind of bone-deep, soul-crushing freeze that settles into your marrow and refuses to leave for half the year. You're eating potatoes. Again. Maybe some herring if you're feeling adventurous. Your entire country is basically a jagged strip of granite and ice desperately clinging to the edge of Europe like it's afraid of falling off. Your neighbors? The Swedes? They're thriving. They've got cars, factories, innovation. Meanwhile, you've got fish, trees, and a national inferiority complex so thick you could cut it with a knife. Now snap your fingers. Today you're born in that same country. But the instant you take your first breath, you're worth over $340,000. On paper. Your nation owns more stocks, bonds, and real estate than you can possibly comprehend. You've essentially won the lottery of life, becoming a trust fund baby on a national scale. This isn't fantasy. This is Norway. And this is the story of how a nation of fishermen stumbled upon the greatest treasure chest in human history, and then, shockingly, decided not to blow it all. This is about discipline, foresight, and one Iraqi immigrant who changed everything. Let's rewind and kill a myth right now. You'll hear people say Norway was a third world country before oil. That's not entirely accurate. They weren't dirt poor in the way we think of extreme poverty today, but they were definitely the embarrassing cousin at family gatherings. Imagine sitting in an Oslo pub in 1955. The vibe? Austere. Depressing. The government is obsessed with post-war reconstruction. They're rationing cars. Yes, you needed a government permit to buy a car until 1960. Luxury was literally a dirty word. The entire economy ran on three things: cutting down trees, digging rocks out of mountains, and throwing nets into the freezing ocean hoping something edible would swim into them. It was brutal, dangerous work. Men died regularly. Families scraped by. And the worst part? Nobody thought it would ever change. The worst prediction in history. But here's where the dark comedy of history kicks in. In 1958, the Geological Survey of Norway, the supposed experts, the guys with PhDs and rock hammers, wrote a letter to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They declared, and I quote, "One can ignore the possibility that there should be coal, oil, or sulfur on the continental shelf along the Norwegian coast." Let that sink in. That's the geological equivalent of Decca Records rejecting the Beatles because guitar groups are on their way out. It might be the single worst professional prediction in the history of economics. At the time, Norwegians looked at the North Sea and saw only trouble. It was a dark, violent stretch of water that swallowed ships and sailors whole. It was a graveyard, not a bank vault. But while Norwegians were eating their potatoes and trusting their geologists, something was happening down south. In 1959, the Dutch discovered the Groningen gas field, the largest natural gas field in Europe. And here's the thing about geology, it doesn't respect borders. If there was gas in the Netherlands and those rock formations stretched north, logic dictated there might be something under that angry Norwegian ocean too. The sharks started circling. In the early 1960s, American oil giants like Phillips Petroleum and Esso came sniffing around. They approached Norway like wolves eyeing a sheep that doesn't know it's sitting on gold. Their proposal was casually predatory. "Hey, we'll take exclusive rights to explore your ocean. We'll pay you a tiny fee. We'll take all the oil." Deal? They thought they were dealing with country bumpkins. They thought they could buy the rights to the entire Norwegian continental shelf for the price of a used car. They forgot one thing. Norwegians might have been poor, but they weren't stupid. The lawyer who drew a line in the ocean. Enter Jens Evensen. Remember this name. Jens wasn't a geologist or an oil expert, he was a lawyer, a bureaucrat. But when the oil companies came knocking, he realized something crucial. International laws about who owned the ocean floor were fuzzy at best. So he did something audacious. He unilaterally declared that Norway owned everything on their side of the North Sea. He essentially drew a line down the middle and said, "Everything on this side? Mine." It was a gangster move. And because nobody really believed there was oil there anyway, the rest of the world just shrugged and said, "Sure, yes. Whatever. Enjoy your wet rocks." This set the stage for everything that followed. For the next few years, it looked like the experts were right. The oil companies drilled. They found nothing. They drilled again. Nothing. Dry well after dry well. Millions of dollars were being set on fire in the freezing North Sea. The mood was grim. By summer 1969, Phillips Petroleum was done. They were packing up. The Norwegian oil dream was dead before it even started. But as the saying goes, it's always darkest just before the dawn. Or in this case, it's always most expensive just before you hit the jackpot. It's late 1969. The chaotic 60s are ending. The Beatles are breaking up. The US just put a man on the moon. And in the North Sea, everyone is miserable. Phillips Petroleum had drilled 37 exploration wells. 37. Do you know how much money that cost? In 1969 money? It was a bloodbath. They went to the Norwegian government and said, "We're out. We're breaking our contract. We're leaving." The Norwegian government calmly pointed to a clause in the contract that basically said, "If you leave now, you pay us a massive penalty fee." Phillips did the math. It was actually cheaper to drill one last hole, a hole they knew would be empty, than to pay the fee to quit. Think about that level of apathy. They were drilling purely out of spite and contractual obligation. They sent the rig, the Ocean Viking, to a spot called Block 2/4. The crew didn't want to be there. It was December. The North Sea in December is hell on earth. 50-foot waves. Freezing sleet. Darkness for 20 hours a day. They just wanted to go home for Christmas. They started drilling on August 21, 1969. On September 16, things went wrong. At 1,662 meters depth, they encountered formations under different pressures. The well kicked. The drillers tried everything, plastic, horse manure, nutshells, to stabilize it. Nothing worked. They had to plug the well, move 1,000 meters away and start again. On October 25, at 3,081 meters depth, something changed. The pressure gauges spiked. The mud loggers noticed anomalies. The downhole gas volume suddenly increased sharply. They'd hit something. The discovery that changed everything. But bad weather struck. A winter storm in early December brought 15-meter waves. Anchors came loose. Ocean Viking began drifting with the derrick fully loaded, in danger of overturning. Part of the crew was evacuated by helicopter. After a terrifying day, the weather calmed enough to tow the rig back. On December 23, literally the day before Christmas Eve, they pulled up the test. It wasn't dry. It wasn't just a little bit of oil. It was a monster. They had punched a hole straight into the Ekofisk field, one of the largest offshore oil basins ever discovered. We're talking billions of barrels. Max Melli, the Italian geologist on site, later described the moment. "I thought we had found a gold mine instead of an oil reservoir. While we were expecting sandstones, we had drilled into what we first described as a calcarenite. More important, it had an intense golden glow under ultraviolet light. I had never seen such oil and gas shows before." The telegram went to Phillips' headquarters in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. The executives thought it was a prank. "Merry Christmas. We found the mother lode." Imagine you're a Norwegian politician on Christmas morning. You wake up, have your coffee, maybe open a present, and then get a phone call telling you that your nation, which has been scraping by on timber and fish for centuries, is now sitting on a geyser of liquid cash. The scale of Ekofisk was terrifying. It wasn't just good news, it was a tsunami of economic implications. Most countries, when they find this much oil, panic in the wrong direction. They see dollar signs. Politicians buy yachts. The military buys tanks. The currency spikes, killing all other industries. It's called the resource curse or Dutch disease. Look at Venezuela. Look at Nigeria. Look at Iraq. Finding oil is often the worst thing that can happen to a developing democracy. It breeds corruption, laziness, and eventual collapse. Norway stood on the edge of this cliff in 1970. They had the winning lottery ticket, but they also had a gun to their head. If they let the Americans extract oil on American terms, Norway would get crumbs while Texas got rich. If they nationalized everything too fast without knowing how to drill, they'd screw it up. They needed a plan. Fast. Norway needed a hero. They didn't get a warrior or a king. They got a polite, soft-spoken Iraqi geologist named Farouk Al-Kasim. You've probably never heard of him, but he is arguably the most valuable immigrant in European history. Farouk was born in Basra, Iraq in 1934. At 16, he was selected by the Iraq Petroleum Company to study petroleum geology in London, at the prestigious Royal School of Mines at Imperial College. There he met Salfred, a Norwegian woman working as an au pair. They fell in love and married. Farouk returned to Iraq in 1957 and quickly rose through the ranks at the Iraq Petroleum Company, overseeing supergiant fields like Kirkuk and Rumaila. He was living the prosperous lifestyle of Basra's upper-middle class. But in 1968, everything changed. His youngest son was born with cerebral palsy. Farouk and Salfred faced an impossible decision. Iraq couldn't provide the care their son needed. Norway could. But moving meant Farouk would abandon his successful career. He had little hope of finding comparable work in Norway. "I was really thinking of working for a petrol station or some such thing," he later recalled, "because that was the only type of oil company I knew existed in Norway. He didn't know oil exploration was underway in the North Sea. And even if he had known, 5 years of drilling had yielded nothing. In May 1968, Farouk had a few hours before his train left Oslo. On a whim, he stopped by Norway's Ministry of Industry to ask if anyone had a list of oil companies working in the country. What happened next changed world history. The ministry officials practically interviewed him on the spot. They must have been absolutely desperate for expertise. Farouk later said. At the time, Norway's entire oil administration consisted of 3 officials, all in their 30s, all learning on the job. Farouk was hired immediately. For 3 months, he examined seismic studies and data from 13 wells, cross-tabulating and mapping results by hand. When he was done, he was convinced Norway was sitting on a doozy of an oil field. He wrote a report warning that Norway was sleeping. Even though no one had found oil yet, it was only a question of time. And time was short. I was a constant reminder that they were doing everything wrong, he said. His colleagues mostly dismissed him with polite, maybes. Only his closest allies would listen. Then came the Ekofisk discovery on Christmas Eve 1969. Suddenly, everyone was listening. Farouk sat down with Norwegian bureaucrats and asked a simple question. Do you want to be an oil nation or a nation that has oil? It sounds like semantics, but it was the difference between salvation and ruin. He told them the oil companies would try to rush them. They would hide data. They would extract maximum profit and leave Norway with crumbs. He'd seen it happen in Iraq and across the Middle East. Norway needed to build its own competence, create its own state oil company and write its own rules, or they would be eaten alive. Together with Norwegian officials, Farouk drafted what became known as the 10 Oil Commandments, passed into law in 1971. This wasn't just legislation. It was an economic declaration of independence. It was the greatest wealth transfer from corporate interests to public hands the world has ever seen. But writing commandments is one thing. Enforcing them against the most powerful corporations on earth? That's a completely different fight. Norway had the oil. But they had zero idea how to get it out of the ground. No technology. No rigs. No engineers. All they had was Jens Evansson's legal paperwork and Farouk Al-Kasim's brain. This is where most countries fold. The oil companies say, we'll take 90% of the profit because we're doing all the work. You take 10% and be grateful. Norway said no. Instead, they did something that made capitalists in New York and London spit out their coffee. In 1972, they created Statoil, now Equinor. Not just a company but a spy agency, university, and bank vault wrapped into one. The deal they offered foreign oil companies was audacious. You want to drill here? Fine. But you must take Statoil as a partner. You have to pay for 50% of their cost. You have to share your technology with them. You have to teach them everything you know. Imagine running a bakery when a stranger walks in and says, I'm going to work here. You're going to pay my salary. You're going to teach me your secret recipes. Eventually, I'm going to open my own bakery next door and put you out of business. That's what Norway did. Legal, state-sponsored corporate espionage. Out in the open. And then came the taxes. Oh man, the taxes. In most places, corporate tax is maybe 20 to 30%. Norway slapped a special petroleum tax on top of regular corporate tax. The total marginal tax rate on oil production? 78%. The oil companies screamed. They threatened to leave. They said it was robbery. Norway called their bluff. They knew the geology now. They knew Ekofisk was a monster. They knew the oil was high quality and located in a stable democracy, not a war zone. So they stared down the Americans and said, the tax is 78%. If you don't like it, leave. We'll drill it ourselves. The companies stayed. They grumbled. But they stayed. Because even with a 78% tax, the profit margins were still insane. That's how much oil was down there. This period, the 1970s and 80s, wasn't all suits and spreadsheets. It was dangerous. In 1980, the Alexander Kielland platform capsized in a storm. 123 men died. It was a national tragedy that shook Norway to its core. It reminded everyone that this wealth was being paid for in blood. It forced the country to implement the strictest safety regulations in the world. If you work on an oil rig today, anywhere on Earth, the safety protocols you follow were likely written in blood in Norway in the 1980s. But as safety improved and technology advanced, the money started to pile up. By the 1990s, Norway was no longer the poor cousin. They were the rich uncle. And that brought a much more dangerous problem. You've probably heard the phrase, more money, more problems. In economics, there's a scientific term for this: Dutch disease. Here's how it works. Let's say you discover a massive gold mine in your backyard. You get super rich. You stop mowing your lawn because you can pay someone else. You stop cooking because you can order out. You quit your job. Everyone in town wants to work for you as a butler or driver. Nobody wants to be a teacher or carpenter because your gold money pays better. The price of everything in your town skyrockets because you're throwing cash around. Then 10 years later the gold runs out. Now you have no job skills. Your lawn is a disaster. The teachers and carpenters have forgotten their trades. You're broke. This happened to the Netherlands in the 1960s, hence the name. It happened to Nauru, the bird poop island, look it up. It happened to Venezuela. When a country finds a resource, its currency value shoots up. This makes all other exports, like fish or timber, too expensive for foreign buyers. Manufacturing dies. The entire economy becomes addicted to one resource. Norway looked at this trap and said, "Not today, Satan." In the 1990s, economists including future NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg realized something crucial. If they spent the oil money inside Norway, they would destroy Norway. If they pumped billions of kroner into the local economy, inflation would explode. A loaf of bread would cost $50. The fishermen couldn't compete. The timber industry would collapse. So they did something that requires a level of psychological discipline that is almost inhuman. They decided to take the money and hide it from themselves. In 1990, Parliament established the Government Petroleum Fund. The idea was simple but radical. Every single dollar of profit from the oil industry, the taxes, the dividends from Statoil, the license fees, would not go into the government's checking account. It would not be used to build bridges or lower taxes or give everyone bonuses. Instead, it would be sent out of the country immediately. They would take the oil dollars and invest them in stock markets outside Norway. They'd buy shares in Apple, Microsoft, Nestle, Toyota. They'd buy real estate in London, New York, Paris. By sending the money away, they kept the Norwegian currency stable. They protected their non-oil businesses. The fishermen could still sell fish. The timber guys could still sell wood. Most importantly, they turned a volatile resource, oil, which runs out, into a perpetual financial machine, stocks and bonds which grow forever. But here's the crazy part. For the first few years, the fund was empty. They used oil money to pay off national debt first. It wasn't until May 1996 that Finance Minister Sigbjørn Johnson made the first deposit, roughly $300 million. He told the press, "This is for future generations." Nobody really paid attention. It was just a bookkeeping entry. But that snowball had just started rolling down the hill. And nobody, not even the optimists, predicted how big it would get. Today that fund is worth approximately $1.8 trillion. As of the end of 2024, it reported record profits of $222 billion for the year alone, the highest annual gain in its history. The fund now owns 1.5% of all listed companies in the world. Think about that. Walk down a street in New York, London, or Tokyo. Look at the businesses around you. Norway owns a piece of them. They own a piece of the street you're walking on. Each Norwegian citizen's theoretical share? Over $340,000. But having $1 trillion creates a weird psychological problem. How do you tell your citizens they can't have better hospitals right now when you're sitting on a mountain of cash? Enter the handlingsregelen, the budgetary rule introduced in 2001. This rule is the financial equivalent of a chastity belt. It states that the government is allowed to use only the real return on the fund to balance the national budget. Historically, they estimated this at 4%. Recently, they lowered it to 3% just to be safe. Here's why this is genius and incredibly difficult. If you spend the principal, the oil money itself, the fund eventually shrinks. You're eating the goose that lays the golden eggs. But if you only spend the interest, the 3%, the fund theoretically lasts forever. It becomes an eternal money machine. Let's look at the numbers. 3% of $1.8 trillion is roughly $54 billion. That $54 billion is injected into the Norwegian economy every year. It covers about 20% of the entire government budget. This means 1 out of every $5 spent on schools, roads, hospitals, and police in Norway comes from interest on investments. No taxes were raised to generate that money. No oil was sold this year to generate it. It's free money from past decisions. Adhering to this rule requires a level of social trust that's almost alien to most countries. In most democracies, if a politician sees a pile of money, they grab it to buy votes. Vote for me and I'll build a stadium. In Norway, if a politician suggests dipping into the fund beyond the 3% rule, they're looked at like a lunatic. They're shamed. They're accused of stealing from their grandchildren. Compare this to Alberta, Canada. Alberta has oil. Lots of it. Similar geology, similar timeline. In 1976 they created a heritage fund. But they didn't have a handlingsregulen. When the economy got tough, politicians dipped into the fund. When voters wanted low taxes, they drained it. Today Norway's fund, $1.8 trillion. Alberta's fund, $16 billion. The difference isn't geology. The difference isn't luck. The difference is that one country had the discipline to say no to themselves, over and over, for 40 years. This creates a weird paradox. Walk around Oslo and it's nice, but it's not futuristic. Roads have potholes. Trains are sometimes late. Hospital waiting lists can be long. You find yourself screaming, "You have $1 trillion. Fix the pothole." The Norwegian answer is always the same. If we fix the pothole with oil money today, our children won't have a pension tomorrow. It's delayed gratification on a national scale. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Norway might be the world's most hypocritical nation. I say that with love. Norway brands itself as the poster child for the Green Revolution. Visit Oslo. The air is crisp. Everything is electric. In 2024, over 80% of new cars sold were fully electric. Teslas are as common as Toyota Corollas in the US. They power their homes almost exclusively with hydroelectric dams. They recycle everything. They lecture the world at UN climate summits about sustainability. But where did the money for those Teslas come from? Where did the subsidies for those wind farms originate? It came from pumping massive amounts of CO2, producing fossil fuels and selling them to the rest of the world. Norway is essentially a drug dealer who doesn't get high on their own supply. They sell the heroin, oil and gas to Germany, the UK and France. They take the cash, go home, eat a salad and drive an electric car while feeling morally superior to the junkies they just sold to. This is the green paradox. The debate intensified after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. As Russian gas pipelines were shut off, Norway cranked production to maximum capacity. They made obscene amounts of money, more in 2022 alone than in several previous years combined. Critics labeled them war profiteers. The Polish Prime Minister suggested Norway should share excess profits. Norway politely declined. But the guilt remains. To assuage it, the Sovereign Wealth Fund has become an activist investor. The fund has an ethics council, a group of philosophers and lawyers who decide where money cannot go. Visit Oslo. The air is crisp. Everything is electric. In 2024, over 80% of new cars sold were fully electric. Teslas are as common as Toyota Corollas in the US. They power their homes almost exclusively with hydroelectric dams. They recycle everything. They lecture the world at UN climate summits about sustainability. But where did the money for those Teslas come from? Where did the subsidies for those wind farms originate? It came from pumping massive amounts of CO2, producing fossil fuels and selling them to the rest of the world. Norway is essentially a drug dealer who doesn't get high on their own supply. They sell the heroin, oil and gas to Germany, the UK and France. They take the cash, go home, eat a salad and drive an electric car while feeling morally superior to the junkies they just sold to. This is the green paradox. The war profiteer. The debate intensified after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. As Russian gas pipelines were shut off, Norway cranked production to maximum capacity. They made obscene amounts of money, more in 2022 alone than in several previous years combined. Critics labeled them war profiteers. The Polish Prime Minister suggested Norway should share excess profits. Norway politely declined. But the guilt remains. To assuage it, the Sovereign Wealth Fund has become an activist investor. The fund has an ethics council, a group of philosophers and lawyers who decide where money cannot go. If a company makes nuclear weapons, banned. If a company produces tobacco, banned. If a company uses child labor, banned. If a company causes severe environmental damage, banned. The fund has blacklisted Walmart for labor rights issues, Boeing for nuclear weapons production and massive mining conglomerates. As of the end of 2024, 67 companies had been dropped due to conduct violations, with another 104 removed for selling prohibited products. When Norway bans a company, it sends shockwaves through financial markets. Other investors think, if Norway thinks they're too dirty, maybe we should sell too. So you have this fascinating dual personality. 1. Drill, baby, drill, extracting millions of barrels of oil and gas. 2. Captain Planet, using profits to force global companies to be greener and more ethical. Is it hypocrisy? Absolutely. Is it effective? Surprisingly, yes. Norway is using proceeds from the old economy, oil, to buy the influence necessary to build the new economy, tech and renewables. But the biggest threat to Norway isn't running out of oil. It isn't a market crash. It's something much more insidious. There's an old saying, hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. Weak men create hard times. Norway is currently deep in the good times phase, and cracks are starting to show. When you have a safety net made of solid gold and diamonds, the fear of falling disappears. And without fear, sometimes the drive to work disappears too. Norway has one of the highest rates of sick leave absence in the world. Sweden and Finland have the same weather, but their sick leave rates are significantly lower. In Norway, if you call in sick, you get 100% of your salary from day one for up to a year. There's no financial penalty for not working. The social welfare system is so generous that there's a slang verb, to nave. NAV is the Norwegian Labor and Welfare Administration. To nave means to live off government benefits. You'll hear teenagers joke, I don't want to study. I'm just going to nave for a year. The oil industry pays so well that it sucks talent from every other sector. Why be a teacher, nurse, or entrepreneur when you can be an assistant petroleum engineer and make $100,000 straight out of school? This kills innovation. Norway produces very few unicorn startups compared to Sweden. Sweden gave us Spotify, IKEA, Skype, Minecraft. Norway gave us oil. An Opera browser. But mostly oil. The fear is that when oil eventually runs out, and it will, Norway will be left with a population that has forgotten how to hustle. A nation of trust fund kids who don't know how to change a tire. But to their credit, they're aware. The debate in Norway isn't just about money, it's about work ethic. They're constantly tweaking rules, trying to find balance between caring for people and spoiling them. It's the ultimate first world problem. Help. My life is too secure. So how did a frozen strip of granite become the richest nation on earth? It wasn't just luck. Yes, finding oil was luck. That was the lottery ticket. But look at lottery winners in your own country. Look at people who win the Powerball. 70% go broke within a few years. They buy the tiger. They buy the mansion. They get addicted. They lose it all. Norway won the lottery. But they didn't act like a lottery winner. They acted like a paranoid accountant. They got rich because of 3 specific decisions. 1. Sovereignty. They had the guts to tell big American companies, we own this. You work for us. Thanks to Jens Evensen drawing that line in the ocean and refusing to cave to corporate pressure. 2. Discipline. They refused to spend money on themselves today, saving it for people who haven't even been born yet. The handlingsregelen, spending only 3% annually, is a masterclass in delayed gratification. 3. Trust. They built a system where people trust the government not to steal the money, and the government trusts experts to manage it. That's the secret sauce. It's not the oil. It's the trust. In most countries, if the government said, we're putting all the money in a fund and not touching it, people would riot. They'd say, you're lying. You're going to steal it. In Norway they said, okay, sounds sensible. The lesson of Norway isn't about geology. It's about character. It teaches us that the greatest resource a nation can have isn't buried underground. It's buried in the minds and culture of its people. Norway is rich because they realize the oil doesn't belong to them, it belongs to the history of the nation. Past, present, and future. They're just temporary guardians. And as long as they remember that, as long as they don't get too lazy, too soft, or too greedy, they'll remain the kings of the North. But perhaps the most important lesson is this. Sometimes the difference between wealth and poverty, between success and failure, isn't about what you find, it's about who you listen to. An Iraqi immigrant with cerebral palsy and his family taught Norway how to avoid the resource curse he'd witnessed destroy his homeland. Farouk Al-Kasim, now 90 years old, was knighted by the Norwegian king in 2012 for his service. He's been called Norway's most valuable immigrant. And he might be one of the most valuable immigrants in world history, proof that the best ideas don't care about borders, and wisdom can come from the most unexpected places. Norway got rich by finding oil. But they stayed rich by listening to someone who knew how easy it was to lose everything. If you enjoyed this deep dive into ice, oil, and trillion-dollar discipline, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about how countries get filthy rich, or spectacularly blow it. And drop a comment. If your country found $1 trillion of oil tomorrow, would your government have the discipline to save it? Or would they blow it all within a decade? See you in the next one.